PA Books is a production of PCN, a nonprofit television network. Listeners like you make our programming possible. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit PCNTV.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
Welcome to the PA Books podcast. I'm Phil Beckman. PA Books features interviews with authors of books about Pennsylvania history, culture, and people. In this episode, we talk with Rodney Ross about his book, Harrisburg in World War I and the 1918 Pandemic.
This week on PA Books, Rodney Ross, author of Harrisburg in World War I and the 1918 Pandemic.
Rodney Ross is the author of Harrisburg in World War I and the 1918 Pandemic. The United States enters World War I in the spring of 1917. How did that impact Harrisburg?
Well, Harrisburg was affected by the war. You're going to find that the residents responded to it in many different ways, positive and negative. But like I said, the war definitely had impact on the people of Harrisburg. And again, like I said, they respond to it in a positive way and also a negative way, which I'll get into later on.
So once war was declared, did the population really kind of come together with an enthusiasm for it?
Nationally, and also in Harrisburg, yes. There were only a few cases of dissent. Harrisburg Peace Society was opposed to the declaration of war. One of the churches had a pacifistic, I think, philosophy, but generally speaking, most Harrisburgers stepped up and supported the war one way or another.
Now, in the book, you talk a lot about flags, that there was a proliferation of flags in the communities at that time. What would it have looked like?
Well, the flags themselves could be found any place. They adorn cars, found in homes, found outside public buildings, and of course, they're an obvious expression of patriotism, just like, the Uncle Sam icon could be seen, virtually every place. Red, white, and blue could be seen virtually every place. References to historical figures could be, of course, recalled by old Harrisburgers. But the flags were pervasive. Banners were pervasive. In fact, it was, I think, an expression of patriotism actually to have a flag and fly a flag and take care of the flag. In fact, the newspapers would make constant reference to how to take care of the flag and how to fly the flag. And disrespect for the flag was not well received in Harrisburg. There were cases where a person showed disrespect, and that person could be physically attacked, roughed up. But again, a very strong expression of patriotism of the American flag. In fact, newspapers actually would have drawings of Francis Scott Keys and Star Spangled Banner. The lyrics will be the front page of newspapers, again indicating the significance of the American flag. Very important symbol of patriotism.
Now, Harrisburg was a major industrial town, steel mills and other factories. How did the war impact Harrisburg's industry?
Well, you're going to find that the federal government made many contracts with Harrisburg firms. The Harrisburg Pipe and Bending Company, which becomes Harrisburg Steel, was involved in actually producing war materials. Also, Central Iron and Steel down in Shipoke was also involved in that. Other businesses could be mentioned, but Harrisburg was making shell casings, explosives, a turbine for the Panama Canal, I think gun emplacements, For the men that were in camps, of course, all kinds of foods were produced, bedding was produced. It surprised me the extent that Harrisburg was involved and stimulated by the war contracts. I thought Harrisburg during both World War I and World War II was like a sleepy town on Susquehanna where not too much was taking place, and both wars were passing Harrisburg by. And that's not true. Harrisburg was actually recognized nationally for its industry, its transportation, the railroads, the distribution service, very important. In fact, Harrisburg was so significant in terms of transportation and also carrying freight. And of course, much of that would be agricultural produce. There was actually talk about dredging the Susquehanna and turning Harrisburg into, I guess, what you would call an inland port. And according to my research, that was not a new idea. That was an old idea, which kind of surprised me. Of course, that didn't come across. But again, the military made that suggestion.
Now, you mentioned some of the different things that Harrisburg was doing. This area, the central Pennsylvania, is a very rich agricultural area, but food needed to be sent to the troops and needed to be sent to our allies. How did that affect access to food in Harrisburg?
Well, there was a national program calling for food preservation. Herbert Hoover headed that administration, food administration. And there's no rationing of food, but Americans nationwide and also in Harrisburg were expected to step up and cut back and conserve as much as possible. A big stress on conservation. So this was done in many ways in Harrisburg. The newspapers offered all kinds of remedies as to how food could be saved, all kinds of recipes where people were encouraged to eat fish instead of meat. And also a program took place in Harrisburg and other cities where when it came to bread, there'd be half and half flour. Maybe instead of course, bread being fully wheat flour, it'd be half wheat and maybe half of something else like rye or peanut flour or some other flour, you know. But all foods on the Harrisburg market were affected. And in many cases, prices shot up, like on turkeys. They became very expensive. It appears pork was available, but a lot of people, I think, resisted raising, pigs, although that was suggested, in many newspaper articles that I came across. But the keynote was this: Hooverize, save, cut back, be more efficient, try new recipes. And this impacted upon not only private homes, but also at hotels that had restaurants, diners, railroad cars that were dining cars, but just impacted Harrisburg, the country, generally speaking. Hooverizing, it was called.
Now, there were some activists who, given the food shortages, didn't want grains to be used to make alcohol. How was that received? There's an organization, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, had a chapter in Harrisburg. Harrisburg also was very Calvinistic. No Sunday movies, no work on Sunday, opposed to gambling. Of course, disorderly houses were no-no. But you're going to find that I would say that the town fathers, the clergy, many holding political office, many in charge of organizations like the YMCA or YWCA, were probably supportive of the idea of cutting back on using grain for alcohol. But the general population, I'm not so sure.
because, saloons were closed on occasion, reopened, and of course people flocked in to the beer joints and the water holes to enjoy alcoholic beverages. Now, of course, Prohibition came about after the war, but like I said, I'm not quite sure about the general population. But again, like I said, the town fathers, the clergy, very much in support of, like I said, not turning rain into alcohol. Now, probably many in the city could accept that temporarily. But I remember in my last chapter I mentioned that some people in Harrisburg, after the war is over, are glad to see that alcohol would be available.
Now, another thing that citizens were encouraged to do was to have gardens as a way to generate food for themselves. How important were war gardens during that time?
They were very significant because, as I had mentioned previously, Herbert Hoover wanted, of course, Americans to conserve food. And one way to do that was, of course, to have your war garden and make your own food. I mean, it supplied groceries to some extent. Food that you sell could be used to pay taxes, or you're saving on the grocery bill. But that was a very important source, a very significant source. And I know the Chamber of Commerce, whose agriculture chapter, was very happy as more and more Harrisburg got involved in the war gardens. And of course, women participated, elderly participated, kids got involved, schools were involved. Many businesses and corporations set aside their property for the war gardens. But that was a very important source of food, particularly because German submarines were so effective in sinking Allied ships. And of course, that caused a food shortage in Europe. And that was a major reason why it was felt that Americans would have to add the food to the food supply by, of course, putting in these war gardens. Now, they had their problems. Sometimes insects came in and, of course, damaged some of the crops. At the same time, there was cats came in, dogs came in, also inflicted damage upon the crops. Then an awful lot of thievery was taking place. And that really upset many Harrisburgers when thieves would steal from the war gardens. But very important source of food. In fact, related to that is canning. That was encouraged. Put up food for the winter that you are growing in war gardens during the summer.
Now, this was also the time when daylight savings time comes into action, but it was intended to be a temporary efficiency measure. While we're still dealing with it today, how did it come about?
Well, it was seen as a war measure, increasing, it came from the federal government, increasing the daylight hours, but of course provide more time for folks who work on war gardens. But also it was seen as a benefit. The kids would have more time to play outside. People, of course, get exercise by maybe walking with increased daylight hours. So it was seen as being beneficial. But I think it really related pretty much to the war gardens, and of course giving people that work during the day, time after work to, of course, work the war gardens with increased daylight.
Now, with the war on, there was a lot of concern for security, and there was some degree of paranoia about sabotage and spies. They put guards on bridges. Describe what that feeling would have been like at that time.
Well, a certain hysteria affected the nation in Harrisburg. High anxiety. Once we entered the war, there was a concern about, I guess, what you would call a fifth column, to borrow a term from World War II in the 1930s, an internal enemy. So heightened security took place, like you mentioned, concerning railroads, concerning bridges, concerning factories, the whole Harrisburg industrial complex. People in many cases were kept off the river, the Susquehanna, out of fear that boats approaching bridges might be involved in some kind of sabotage. But security was upgraded an awful lot right after we entered the war itself. And that probably was due also to the fact that you had a large German-speaking population within the Harrisburg area. They are concerned about the so-called Pennsylvania Dutch. Now, to my knowledge, the Pennsylvania Dutch and Pennsylvania Germans overall were, of course, quite loyal throughout the war. But again, you had that fear, that anxiety that might not be the case. And this fear was stimulated by, of course, propaganda coming down from Washington, George Creel's organization, the Committee on Public Information, pounding propaganda into the minds of the American people, in Harrisburg in particular. Movies stimulated that fear, that insecurity. I mentioned in chapter 1 two women speaking Spanish, and some thought that was some kind of a code, by subversives within the Harrisburg area. But it was really, I think, exaggerated and overplayed. But of course, at the time, with the atmosphere the way it was, you didn't know. You just didn't know.
Now, part of that fear manifested itself in a cartoon that you have in the book of children pretending to execute a spy. It seems a bit extreme.
It was. But again, it shows the extent, the degree that the hatred for the enemy, developed during the war. And again, I would attribute that to the Creel Committee concerning, of course, what public information. I mean, they're pounding the American people and the people of Harrisburg with propaganda, and it's coming from 4 Minutemen that come in and make short speeches in front of audiences, maybe in motion picture theaters, or at the YMCA or YWCA or the Red Cross or the Chamber of Commerce or the Civic Club. But, it's seen, in, like I said, cartoons, editorials, newspapers, magazines, pamphlets, posters, just being bombarded constantly. So I can understand even little kids feeling. I have a story in the book about some children that are playing a game, and they place an African-American child inside, I think, a box. And he plays the role of the Kaiser. And they bombard the box with bricks, and they guess pebbles and stones. And of course, the African-American child jumps up and says, "I'm not going to be the Kaiser anymore, But it shows that hatred, that distrust, that fear seeped down, even, of course, affected kids, little children. And I guess that cartoon reflects that.
Now, you mentioned the anti-German hysteria that went throughout the country. The country had you mentioned that the 1910 census counted about 8 million Germans in the United States. But it even moved itself to the point where they were renaming the word hamburger to Harrisburger. And sauerkraut became Liberty cabbage. And to talk about some of the measures that were taken to counter German cultural influence.
Well, German music was not accepted by most of the Harrisburgers because it was German. It was identified with Prussians. Prussians were identified with militarism. And of course, probably most people in the country and most Harrisburgers actually blame Germany for starting the war. But then you have all this hateful propaganda coming out of Europe, British, French, from Belgium, concerning German hostile atrocities, how they're mistreating French women, Belgian women, molestations, raping taking place, children having their hands cut off, allegations by Allied propagandists. So, you know, this just intensified the dislike of anything German because it was suspect. And if I could, being a former educator, I'd like to point out how that affected German in the schools in Harrisburg. Because you're going to find not only making sure that faculty members were pro-American and not pro-German, eventually the Harrisburg School District, along with Susquehanna Township, Lancaster, and many schools throughout the United States, eventually the Harrisburg School District took a course, German, out of the schools. And I think that's unfortunate. Now, there were some arguments by a few individuals trying to counter that, but that seemed to be an expression of public sentiment. And I just love that cartoon in the book that shows Uncle Sam digging a coffin for another dead language, in this case, German.
Now, this was a period of voluntarism. A lot of organizations were created, and during the war, people volunteered to contribute in different ways with the Red Cross and other organizations. Can you talk about some of the volunteering that was going on to help the war effort?
Well, I would have to pick the Red Cross. I mean, they stand out, like I said, is very, very active, making dressings. Nurses are volunteering, women are knitting. In fact, knitting, you know, becomes an obsession, as I mentioned in the book. But I would say, first of all, the Red Cross. I also liked the Civic Club, which is on Front Street in Harrisburg. They had a hostess house for soldiers coming into Harrisburg. They were quite accommodating. Dances, presentations, eats, or whatever. The YMCA was very accommodating, as was the YWCA. The Young Men's Hebrew Association was quite accommodating. At the same time, the Chamber of Commerce had volunteers heavily involved in, well, as I mentioned before, the War Garden work. Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts were heavily involved. Getting back to the Red Cross, women volunteered there. And they drove cars to make deliveries. And the amazing thing about that is many women would take courses concerning car mechanics. So in case the car broke down when they're on their runs, they, of course, would take care of the problem. But again, I would say the Red Cross stands out on top. The Civic Club, the Ys, the Boy Scouts, the Girl Scouts. And one more thing, Alice Eaton at the Harrisburg Library did a tremendous job in providing books for the various military camps and also providing literature concerning the war. I mean, she should be recognized also along with the library for the work that was being done.
We'll be back in a moment with the PA Books Podcast.
Enjoying this podcast? Please support PCN with a donation at pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
Now, as men were going into the military and going overseas, created a labor shortage, and that opened up opportunities for women. How did that affect women in the workforce?
Well, more women were employed, more women were encouraged to get educations to replace men. I did mention the war gardens already, women working there, but eventually you'll find the railroad will hire women. The Harrisburg Railroad, the Harrisburg Railways, which ran the trolleys, were considering hiring women. Some women actually found work, not so much in the mills, but were employed by the steel companies. And women, in many cases, were hired to do the work that men used to do, but of course, men in uniform weren't around to do that work. And I had mentioned a woman was seen painting a barber's pole, and which signed actually surprised a lot of people. Women were also involved in messenger service, working for quarry firms, but they were replacing men because men weren't available. Women also ran elevators, in buildings. Another, line they were kept out of. They were chauffeurs. In some cases, found work as far as, the area police work was concerned. But in many areas where, like I said, men used to monopolize, women stepped up and stepped in because, again, of course, the men were not, around.
Now, there were extensive recruitment efforts to bring men into the military, and there was also a draft. Can you talk about how the recruiting of soldiers contributed or connected with conscription? If a local community had enough people didn't necessarily get drafted?
Well, Harrisburg stands out for his volunteering, and men stepped up. And I think after the War Declaration in early April, there wasn't too much convincing to be done. Because men volunteered after the war was declared, and after selective service was passed in late May of 1917 by the Congress, and registration took place before the draft, there was no problem concerning registration nationwide or in Harrisburg. Now, when the draft took place, I think overall, the draft in Harrisburg went smoothly, and Harrisburg men complied. There were some cases where when it came to registration forms, once the draft came in, that men might have given phony addresses or fake households. But I think in most cases it was compliance. Now, there were a few exceptions took place. One man took poison when it looked like he recalled. At the same time, another fellow shot himself in the foot and lost some toes, so of course he wouldn't have to serve. One fellow had all his teeth pulled, and going toothless, thought he would of course be deferred. But he walked into the recruiting office, and here he was told, "You have flat feet. What are you doing here? Get on out, So he had his, of course, teeth pulled for no good reason. He'd be deferred anyhow. But in most cases, if there's any theme, it's compliance. I think Americans, stepped up and volunteered and made a contribution as far as manpower was concerned, which was greatly needed in Europe, particularly by 1918, because that was after the Bolshevik Revolution, Russia's out of the war. You're going to find morale was down in Italy, morale was down in Britain, morale was down in France. Submarines are taking a heavy toll. And the Western powers really needed American manpower. And Americans, like I said, met the challenge.
Now, throughout the book, some of your main sources are newspapers, local Harrisburg newspapers. Talk about the role of newspapers in the community during the war.
In one word, supportive. Supportive, very supportive. They covered the war. They provided maps, editorial support. At the same time, they encouraged people to take up war gardens. There were all kinds of advisories concerning how to work a war garden, when to plant, when not to plant, fertilizing, what crops to put in, but all kinds of, like I said, ideas and advisories concerning war gardens. At the same time, they carried cartoons that were war referenced. They carried comic strips that were referenced. They carried also letters from residents that had questions about the war or supported the war in some way. They also recorded church sermons, which in some way or another dealt with the war. Either the Red Cross, the YMCA, the draftees. They kept track of casualties, men killed, men wounded, men missing. But they did that as a service for, of course, Harrisburgers. At the same time, they had photographs of Americans that might have died in the war or might have been wounded. But that, of course, was also a part of what they provided. They also, at the same time, provided advisories for young girls concerning young men in uniform, where, of course, young girls might be attracted to that fellow now in his new appearance. And these columnists, urged young women not to take rides with strange soldiers in cars, and advised on letter writing, which they said should be regular, advised on marriage, but all kinds of advice given to young girls concerning their relationships and how, of course, the war affected conventions, what was proper, and how to behave under new circumstances. An immense contribution by newspapers. I'm talking about the old Harrisburg Telegraph, the Courier, the Evening News, and the Patriot. A tremendous support for the war.
Now, a war also affected things that seem trivial, like toys, the children's toys. How did the war affect toys?
Well, first of all, you don't buy German. And there were German toys on the market in Harrisburg. Don't buy German. Don't buy German-made toys. And the toys themselves would take on, of course, say, a military appearance, or say something about the war going on. For example, there might be toy tanks, or there might be toy guns, or toy soldiers. But like I said, in some way they expressed the war, and like I said, was taking place, globally throughout, the war at this time.
Now, one of the terms that is repeated in the book is slacker, and people are warned, don't be a slacker. What did that mean during the war?
Well, that's so someone that wouldn't register to the draft. That would be someone that, if called, would not show up. A slacker could be a deserter. A slacker could be someone not buying Liberty bonds or war stamps. A slacker could be someone not putting a war garden. A slacker could be someone hanging out in pool halls or saloons, or just hanging around the street corners and not finding regular employment. A slacker could be someone that's showing up for work. But slackers generally were individuals that were seen as not doing their bit. That was the term that went around at this time, not doing their bit and making come a contribution towards the war effort.
Now, part of your book also talks about the influenza epidemic of 1918. Mm-hmm. How serious was that? We've gone through an epidemic ourselves. Take us back there, and how significant was that epidemic?
Well, it was interference. It affected the smooth operation of Harrisburg when it came to prosecuting and supporting the war. High absentee rates affected services like trolley services. and also manufacturing complexes and agricultural productivity. At the same time, railroads ran off schedule. Soldiers were delayed in getting to camp. At the same time, you'll find that you would have organizations supporting the war having difficulty meeting. The Red Cross, for example, found one auxiliary at the Jewish home canceled a meeting. It slowed and interfered with bond raising. So it had a tremendous impact in interfering with the operation of the home front as they made contributions towards prosecuting the war.
Now, one of the things that you quote in the book is an effort to get women to not wear high heels. And you said, there's a quote from the Evening News that says, "The women who selfishly and foolishly choose vanity instead of common sense for their parade footgear." And it says, "In the manner of war service, even the choice of one's shoe heels, since it involved working efficiency, is not one's own business."
Well, it affected balance. And many women in the factories, of course, had to revise how they were dressed. For example, their hair had to be up. And, something covering their hair so what their hair wouldn't roll in the machines, get clogged in some way, or maybe, of course, at the same time pull the machines. But I think that's related to that, along with the fact that leather was in great demand during the war. So, of course, it was a means of conserving leather. So I think out of safety concerns for women that, of course, were involved in marches and so many parades in Harrisburg during the war, they had better balance, and of course their feet wouldn't ache and get sore, and also they'd be safer as they worked, in what mills and plants, but also as a, like I said, a conservation measure.
Now, you also talk in the book about a coal famine, and how did that affect the ability of people to get through the winter?
Well, that affected not only, of course, the comfort of people to use coal as a fuel, but at the same time, it affected the production of electricity and affected lighting. Lighting as far as streets were concerned, and business establishments and homes and whatever. But there's no doubt about it that when people substituted, let's say, wood or newspapers or something else for coal, they probably didn't get the same heat and have the same comfort that, of course, they had when they were burning coal. They found, as I mentioned, substitutes, but also unoccupied houses didn't obviously burn coal. Rooms that were not occupied went unheated. So it definitely had an effect on individual comfort and also, of course, how people went about their lives.
How did the war affect the cost of living?
It went up. It went up very high. I think I have a quote in the book that at one point the cost of living in one area is up 88%. But food's more expensive, clothing is more expensive, footwear is more expensive. You'll find virtually anything that you're buying is more expensive. Cosmetics, services, but everything became more and more expensive as far as wars. Of course, there were taxes, war taxes. Now, 1/3 of the war was paid for by taxes. And taxes on transportation, amusements, clothing, again, footwear, other items could be mentioned. 2/3 of the war would be financed by loans of the government. The government had 4 liberally loans during the course of the war, and then one victory loan after the war was over. But inflation was a major problem. And that's something that didn't take place during World War II, but it did take place during World War I, a high cost of living. Now, I have read, and I mentioned in the book, that during the war, of course, there were more jobs, and people were gainfully employed, and wages went up. So in a sense, the increase in wages offset the higher cost of living. And that's why during the war, at least in Harrisburg, I don't know of any labor disturbances over the issue of wages not keeping up with the cost of living. Now, there is a strike after the war's over, I think, which concerns wages. But wages were able to keep up somewhat with the cost of living, but the cost of living certainly, of course, did jump up. Inflation was a major problem.
Now, during the war, not only did soldiers go overseas, but there were a lot of soldiers stationed in this area. And how did having an influx of soldiers in Harrisburg affect the community?
Well, they came in, and it's difficult to determine a percentage breakdown of those soldiers that behaved and those that didn't. But, of course, the effort was being made during the war to find soldiers wholesome entertainment, not only at the encampments, but also in any cities that they might visit when, of course, they went on furlough. So that meant that the Ys were active, the YMCA, the YWCA, the Jewish YMCA, the Civic Center. At the same time, you're going to find, even though and of course the library should be mentioned too, it's trying to, in churches, but at the same time you had an effort to get soldiers into the churches, the library, these wholesome social outlets like the Y or like the Civic Center. You're going to find that many were attracted to movies, which were frowned upon by many Harrisburgers as being the houses of the devil. And at the same time, of course, you had a lot of disorderly houses and streetwalkers. And of course, many soldiers ended up going to these, houses of ill repute. In fact, streetwalking was a major problem at this time, along with soldiers going to saloons, drinking, getting involved in fights, purchasing booze illegally, some soldiers involved in crime activity, fist fights, drunken brawls, robberies. But like I said, there was a concern about streetwalking because the fear was this: if you have soldiers visiting disorderly houses, they, of course, could contract VD. And I think I mentioned, or maybe it's mentioned in the book that I read, that there was a view that more soldiers on both sides, the German side and the American side, were disabled by soldier disease than by bullets during World War I. And I remember my mother, when she was alive, telling me, when she was a little girl, she was born in 1913, two prostitutes from Pembroke, were streetwalkers when she was young. And their names are Fudge and Fury. So I guess Fudge and Fury, peddled their wiles, in Harrisburg, when soldiers came in for R&R during World War I.
How did you become interested in this topic?
Well, I have a doctorate degree in history from Penn State, and a master's as well from Penn State, and social studies degree from Harrisburg. And I taught for 47 years, 7 years in the Harrisburg School District, and then 47 years in Harrisburg, for a total of 54 years, I should say. But I got hooked on Harrisburg, I think, because of my parents' influence. My mother always told me when I was a kid, I wonder how people lived during olden times. So it sparked my curiosity. My dad, who was a Harrisburg cop at 2nd and Walnut, would go into the garbage cans of the old Harrisburg library and pick out books they threw away. And many books were history books, and he brought them home. And I read those books, like William Sharer's Berlin Diary, a book about pre-World War II, or maybe books about the U.S. Navy during World War II, or other books of titles I can't remember. I think maybe a book about the Bataan Death March. But I think my parents had an influence. My 8th grade teacher and other teachers also, I think, influenced my interest in history. But I'm 83, and I'm still a history buff. And I'm working right now on my 3rd book concerning Harrisburg between 1939, September the 1st, when war broke out in Europe, and December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor, where I want to see how Harrisburg prepared for World War II. And I'm amazing what I'm finding out, how active Harrisburg was when it came to defensive measures, just in case we would get involved in the war. But I love history, and I'll be doing, I guess, something in history until I kick the bucket. You know, I just love history.
Now, you also wrote a book about Harrisburg and World War II. How is Harrisburg different between in these two wars?
Well, again, Harrisburg mobilized. The war was longer, World War II, than World War I. You had Harrisburgers making contributions. The organization I brought to your attention, like the Chamber of Commerce, the Red Cross, the Harrisburg Library, the Ys, the churches. I mean, they came out in full force, as I mentioned already. A lot of parades, a lot of marches. Schools got involved. John Harris, Edison, Camp Curtin Junior High, William Penn, which I hope they won't tear down, you know, was involved also. Old Catholic High, which is now Bishop McDevitt, made contributions. But I think because the war lasted for 4 years, the involvement was much more intense, as of course, at the same time being over a longer period of time. A special interest to me during World War II is again the role played by Harrisburg newspapers. The Harrisburg Telegraph provided the same services as I mentioned earlier. The Patriot News provided the same services, the Evening News. The Courier becomes the Harrisburg Sunday Courier. Now, it goes out of business in 1942, but also it provides many services. But if any institutions in Harrisburg, and of course Harrisburg was a major industrial complex, producing munitions, a major distribution center, also of course other supplies. But if any institutions provided services that I greatly admire and I pay attention to, because I'm an old movies buff, it was the Harrisburg theaters. The Rio Theater on Walnut Street, the Lowe's Theater on Market Street, the Senate Theater on the Square, the Colonial also on Market Street, and then you had the State Theater as well, you know. But they showed propaganda movies, newsreels. They aided recruiting. They supported, of course, bond drives. They had stage shows related to the military. But like short subjects, cartoons, all relating to the war. But I plan to write a book, if I live that long, it will be my 4th book, on the contributions made by Harrisburg movie theaters between 1941 and in 1945. Movies like Remember Pearl Harbor, Casablanca, and of course Bataan, Back to Bataan, many could be mentioned, you know.
Now, we've talked about newspapers, and throughout the book, you're quoting newspapers from the time during World War I. How readily available are those archives for you as a researcher?
The Harrisburg, I should say the Dauphin County Library System has them online. And if you're a member of the library, and of course all you do is simply punch in your membership digits, and also of course when you punch in your PIN number, and boom, it comes right up. And they have newspapers from Harrisburg and other communities throughout, Pennsylvania. And I would say that's my primary source. I used a number of secondary sources. I used the internet. I used, of course, professional journals, book reviews. But if I would hold any one source most dear, it would be the information I got from the old Harrisburg Telegraph that I think went out of existence in 1948, and also the Harrisburg, the Courier, and also the Evening News. And like it's readily available if you're a member of the Dauphin County Library System.
We've been speaking with Rodney Ross. He is the author of Harrisburg and World War I and the 1918 Pandemic. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's been my pleasure.
Listeners like you make PCN programming possible. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN Select app. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.